Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Christo and Jeanne Claude, inventors of a new art form. I'm so glad to be with you here today, even if it's only virtually, but I hope to inform you of who Christo and Jeanne Claude were and why I call them the inventors of a new art form. I was inspired to talk about Christo because he recently died on May 31st, 2020. And he lasted his wife by almost 10 years. Jeanne Claude, his wife, sole partner, and as well as business partner, died in 2009. Let me share a little bit about who I am in case this is your first meeting with me. My name is Josephine Withers. I'm an art historian and I taught for many years at the University of Maryland, and where I taught mostly modern art history as well as feminist studies and feminist art history. And now I live in the East Bay area of California, and I'm delighted to offer some of my thoughts on contemporary and modern art to all of you. So let's get started. The reason that I'm starting with this work of art of theirs, an environmental work of art, Running Fence, is because it took place in not too far from where we are in the East Bay. Some of you who have been living in California for a long time may remember the running fence, which was installed in 1976, although the years that I give here on this slide, 1972 to 76, represent the time of the planning and so forth, and really the installation, such as you see here in the photo on the right, would only have lasted a matter of weeks. And that is one of the signature aspects of all of Christo and Jeanne Claude's work, that it's not intended to last. On the left, you see a map of a partial map of Marin County that actually went over into Sonoma County as well, and for 25.5 miles of this running fence that you're seeing here. So think about that, putting up all that hardware, kind of like shower curtains that you see hanging from the wires and the poles and so forth, that kind of dance across the landscape there. And as you look at the map on the left, you'll see that they had to do a dance across the landscape as well. And it was not at all a straight line. Now, actually, that adds to the beauty, as you can see from this photograph on the right, as it kind of goes swerving and really following the contours of the hills in Marin and Sonoma. But one of the important reasons why you see it dancing across the map as well is that they had to get permission from each and every landowner. So imagine what a task that was. It's amazing they only did it in 4 years rather than 10 years. So they had to negotiate each parcel of land over that 25-mile stretch to get the permission from the farmers and the other people who owned the land that they wanted to use. I'll have more to say about this a little bit later, about the interactions that Christo and Jeanne Claude had with the various authorities and landowners that they had to deal with for each one of their projects, because it's a very interesting and important part of their working manner. I'm showing you a few other slides here of the running fence. On the left is where it went disappeared into the ocean there. And on the right is one of many, many, many drawings that Christo made, preparatory drawings. And you see it how, as I run the cursor here, you can see how it's drifting right off into the ocean. I should point out that that last part of the running fence that disappeared into the ocean is the one part of this project that he did not get permission for. It was a permission that was denied by whatever authorities controlled that part of the coastline. So he had to do it, so to speak, by the dark of the night, but you can see that he got beautiful photographs out of it. And here you see Christo himself. Another point I want to highlight here is that I've already said that all of his projects, as big as they are, were not permanent. They were only intended to be up for maybe a few weeks or at most a month. And so how did he fund that? Imagine, it would have taken millions of dollars for labor, for the materials, everything. He actually never applied for public money or any other kind of grants. He raised his money by drawings such as this. So he produced a lot of drawings and models and prints and so forth to really support the larger environmental projects. And here you see on the left side a picture of the installation. He had, of course, a whole team of both paid and volunteer workers. I should say that some of the farmers who owned the land were perhaps initially skeptical, but some of them actually came around with great enthusiasm and even offered volunteer work on the installation of the fence. So you see it being installed here, the curtains going up, and then another picture of Christo inspecting the work when that part was finished. So that was in the 70s. That's already when Christo and Jeanne Claude are well established. Now we're going to go back in time and do a little bit more of a chronological survey. And before we leave, though, just think to yourself if any of you were actually able to see the running fence when it was installed during the short time in 1976. And you might have memories of what that was like, what your experiences were, and so forth. So now we're going back to the 1960s. On the left, you see Christo on the left and his wife, Jeanne Claude, at that time, his fairly new wife. They were both born on the same day, June 13th, 1935. Christo from Albania, and Jeanne Claude was born in Algeria, but she's a French citizen. And and by the time that they met in the 60s, of course, Christo had escaped from Eastern Europe through Berlin and was a resident in Paris. And the way that they met was that Jeanne Claude's mother had commissioned a portrait for herself. And of course, Christo had had a very academic training in Bulgaria. And so he accepted the commission, and that's how he met Jeanne Claude, and the rest was love at first sight. And as I mentioned earlier, they really were soul partners and also life partners as well as business collaborators. And the kind of role that Jeanne Claude had pretty much throughout their life together was as the business partner, as the manager. Imagine these big projects. I mean, it really needed a lot of on the ground managing with many people and institutions and paperwork and the rest. So, and then on the right, of course, is a much more contemporary photograph of the two of them still very much together while she was still alive. Here on the left is one of Christo's early works, And he started out with these very entertaining sort of wrappings. I'll get to the picture on the right in a moment. So this was in the 1960s. They were still living in Paris. And so this is a portrait of Jeanne Claude, and you can probably recognize her from the photo we just saw. And so there's something a little mysterious about not showing the portrait, but rather wrapping it up in this rather casual kind of way. Well, he was taking the bead from a very notorious object that was created by the American artist Man Ray way back in 1920. And you're seeing this even more mysterious package on the right side, all wrapped up in a blanket so you can't even see what's underneath it, and that's quite purposeful, but wrapped up in this kind of casual way, a little bit like Christo's portrait on the left-hand side. Well, this object by Man Ray, who incidentally spent a lot of his career in Paris, so he was very much a part of the Parisian art scene. So we're going to take a little closer look at that object to have a better understanding of how that fed into the pop art, and before that, the surrealist movement of the 1930s and then the 1960s. So here you're seeing a full photograph of it. And this object, which Man Ray photographed, was inspired by just a single line from an obscure poet and novelist of the 19th century who had been rediscovered by the surrealists back in the 1930s. And the title of that little prose poem is called The Chant de Malheureux. And so Isidore Ducasse is his real name, but he went by the pen name of Le Comte de Lautréamont. And so the quote that sort of really inspired not only the surrealists, but specifically Man Ray, was imagining a situation as beautiful as the chance meeting on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. That sort of summed up the perfect surrealist idea of unexpected, unexplainable congruence of objects, which of course Man Ray made even more mysterious because he wrapped the whole thing up in a blanket, so you can't even really understand or see what's underneath it. And we have to take it on faith that there is an umbrella and a sewing machine there, but who knows, it just adds another level of mystery. So that, to go back to what we were looking at before with these wrappings, that was part of the Parisian pop art movement of the 1960s, of really creating all kinds of surprises in terms of what is art. Not unlike what was happening in the United States with figures like Claes Oldenburg. And I'm showing you a comparison here between an early 1960s object by Oldenburg on the left, this limp toilet made out of vinyl, and then on the right, another one of Christo's early wrappings, a shopping cart, and pointing to the absurdity of everyday objects. So that was something that was very much in the air, on both sides of the Atlantic, in this country as well as in Paris. Well, it didn't take very long for Christo to go public, or at least to bust out of the small scale of these early wrappings, like the ones that I've shown you. And this is his very earliest, shall we call it, an environmental work, very ironically called The Iron Curtain. Remember that he emigrated from behind the Iron Curtain, and the Iron Curtain was very much in view and a political thing to be reckoned with in the 60s. And so what they did, he and his team, you can see he got a hold of a bunch of rather rusty um, oil barrels here, and he clogged this very small little street, Rue Visconti, by the dark of the moon, so to speak. And it's one of the few projects for which he did not get any kind of permit. And so he knew that he had to kind of fly by night, so to speak, to get this job done. So probably it was up for a matter of hours, a lot of photographs taken, and then the thing taken down. I don't think that the police quite found them out before they were able to disassemble it. But this shows you the direction in which he was going, getting not only in discrete objects, but really beginning to spread out into the environment and having various kinds of impact on the environment, be it in the country or in an urban setting. So you see here the transition from objects. Here he's kind of semi-wrapped what looks like a baby stroller. And then he really went big. And we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about the wrapped coast that you see on the right. But just think about the change of scale that represented. Going from these discrete objects that could be shown in an art gallery, for example, and sort of framed in that particular way. And then busting out into a very, very large landscape situation where there is no quote unquote framing to kind of give it an art context. So this is the wrapped coast. It's his earliest really large environmental work, aside from the Iron Curtain that we just looked at a moment ago. And it's a very rocky coast near Sydney, Australia. And so this is already in 1968, 69. By then, he and Jeanne Claude had emigrated to the United States. And this is a wonderful photograph because it shows on the left, it shows Christo kind of like the master of the works, directing this great symphony with all these legions of helpers who probably had mountain climbing skills in order to clamber up and down the cliff as they were wrapping it. And you can see that they were rappelling up and down in order to secure the fabric on the cliffs. So here we see Christo in full scale, and the kind of scale that he will pursue, he and Jeanne Claude will pursue for most of their lives in their major projects. So only a few years later, he did the first environmental project in the continental United States called Valley Curtain. It was installed in Rifle Gap in Colorado. You can see it's right in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. Very beautiful classic view on the left. And then you can see that it really got torn apart. You can imagine in that gap there that there were very powerful winds sucking through that gap, that canyon, and no surprise, the curtains, the bright red curtains, were ripped apart. Now, there was a lot of controversy around this piece, as there were for all of Christo's pieces. It was a kind of controversy that he actually enjoyed and he welcomed. And we'll have more to say about that a little bit later, about this sort of dialogue, if you will, between himself, his environmental artworks, and the public. That actually, he saw that as part of the work of art. It wasn't just a thing out there in nature for, let's say, 2 weeks, but rather the total work of art included all the kind of conversations and the discussions and the arguments and the permits and so forth that went into creating and actually installing one of these works. So imagine if you didn't know about this work and you were driving along the highway, like you see this car here, and lo and behold, wow, just before you, you see this totally unexpected, unnatural thing in this natural landscape, very rural, no houses, anything like that, although there is a telephone pole there, and a bright crimson red as a total contrast with the more subtle colors of the distant mountains and the Rifle Valley Gap that you see on each side. That would have been quite a wow to be there, especially if you just happened on it and didn't have any expectation of seeing such a thing. If you're wondering about how people got through on the road, well, there was a kind of like an arc in the curtain there, so that an arc that went over the highway, so it didn't impede traffic in any kind of way. So here's a little bit more of an elaboration on Christo's response to the various kinds of criticism. I'm an artist and I have to have courage. Do you know that I don't have any artworks that exist? And that goes to the point of his deliberately taking down all of his works, maybe 2 weeks or a month after they are installed. They all go away when they're finished. Only the preparatory drawings and the collages are left, giving my works an almost legendary character. And that's true. I think it takes much greater courage to create things to be gone than to create things that will remain. It's an interesting perspective there. Jeanne Claude was a firm believer in the aesthetic beauty of works of art. She said, we want to create works of art of joy and beauty, which we will build because we believe it will be beautiful. And so we return, because we're doing something of a chronology here, to the running fence. So that, in other words, follows on when they installed the curtain in Colorado, they were already working on the preparation, the drawings and creating the materials and so forth for running fence, because that was begun in 1972, if you'll remember, and installed in 1976. So several years later, you can imagine if the surrounded islands were installed in 1983, that they were probably already working on them in the 70s, because some of these works took a really long time. Now let's look at this a little closer. The surrounded islands. It's a very different perspective and dimensionality to it than either the wrapped coast in Australia or the gap in Colorado. This is much more pictorial. And some of the best views actually are from an airplane or helicopter, whatever, from the air, looking straight down. And it's no accident that Jeanne Claude had a very important influence on the design of surrounded islands. Because remember what she said, she is one that really appreciates the beauty of these works. And she had I would say, something of a painterly mind. And it's no accident that there's some interesting correspondence between the late works of Monet, which you see on the right here, one of his late paintings of lily pads. And you're not looking across at them, but sort of at an angle down at them. So it sort of flattens things out, not unlike what you see in the view of the surrounded islands on the right side. But let's go back to that first slide a little bit. Lily pads. You have a beautiful white or pink flower in the middle, and then you have green lily pads surrounding it. And so they reversed it. In the Biscayne Bay, which goes between the mainland of downtown Miami and Miami Beach, which is on the east side of the Biscayne Bay, there's some 12 of these tiny little islands. There may be more, but they actually worked with 12 of these islands going up and down this protected bay between Miami Beach and Miami. I happened to be there earlier. It was probably in late 82 or early 83. It was before they started the actual installation. But I did actually go have a chance to go to the factory. They had rented this enormous factory to produce all of these, the surround, so to speak. And it was really quite fascinating to see whole reams of people that had been hired in order to create these fabric lily pads, these pink pads. So let's go forward again and see that comparison. This is a very nice photograph on the right from the air, which shows how these surrounded islands kind of marched on down the Biscayne Bay. And on the map on the right, it gives you a better idea of the relationship between the water and the land. Miami Beach on the left-hand side, and a little part of the mainland, downtown Miami, on the right. And this gives you a sense of the quality of the fabric. And I originally had a little sample of the fabric that I got at the factory when I visited there. I'm sorry I don't have it anymore, but it shows you that it was some kind of a plastic material, not a natural material, that in a basket weave, so that you can see it's very open. And that's important because this project, like practically all of his other big environmental projects, was really kind of like a whole, had much correspondence and back and forth and arguments with the local authorities, because imagine the kinds of permits that he had to get from all different kinds of environmental groups, as well as the city authorities of Miami Beach and Miami, in order to go forward with this project. And I remember that there was one argument made by the environmental people that was particularly amusing to me. One of the animals, one of the large animals that is here in and lives in the bay, as these big kind of seal-like creatures. And they were worried that covering those surrounding those islands with this fabric would somehow suffocate or be a problem for all these animals and fish and so forth that naturally live there. But they found that actually they quite liked it, and they liked the kind of seclusion of having this roof over their head, this pink roof, and so in order for them to even get to this point of having the surrounded islands, the Christo and Jeanne Claude had to make all kinds of environmental impact studies that would assure people that there was no harm done. And I should say that one of their jobs was that they took on, volunteered, was to clean up all the trash on all these little islands. So they left it in a better situation than they had found it. Now I wanted at this point to make a contrast with the work of Richard Serra. I'm showing you a piece of sculpture by Richard Serra, which some of you may remember because it was installed for a year or so, a few years back at the time of the reopening of SF MoMA. And this multi-ton spiral kind of steel sculpture that Serra is very well known for was part was there installed for, as I say, for about a year. And the reason I chose that is because some of you may be familiar with it because it lived here for a period of time. And I want to make a contrast by paraphrasing one commentary or critic who appreciates Christo for his levity, his sense of delight, his sense of play, and contrasting that with the annoying seriousness of Serra, which is true. I mean, there's many things to like and love about Serra, but humor and lightness and playfulness is not part of his game plan. So I just thought I'd insert that as a little sidebar there. And returning once again to these lovely, much flatter, I mean, you see them more as two-dimensional images in most of the pictures that I could find, compared to the much more sculptural and three-dimensional wrappings, such as the running fence, which really defines the topography of Marin and Sonoma counties. And what could be more sculptural than the bridge that we are looking at on the left-hand side? Now think for a moment, the projects that we have looked at so far, it's as if he started in the sort of the outback, whether it's Colorado or the cliffs off of Sydney, and he begins to close in on the city, and that progression will continue. Now, this is like coming back home, especially for Jeanne Claude, who was, of course, French by origin. The Pont Neuf in Paris is the oldest bridge in Paris, and I'm going to move my picture a little bit so you can see that it was inaugurated in 1607. Wow, and it's still standing and very strong and so forth. It's really strong and very three-dimensional. It's very sculptural. We'll see some close-ups in just a moment. And this is a bridge that is the oldest bridge. There were no other bridges, across between the Ile de la Cité and the main part of Paris. Before this bridge. So it was always a very important bridge. And then at the very far end, the other end of the Ile de la Cité, the little island in the middle of the Seine, which the most important famous monument there, of course, is Notre Dame Cathedral. So this is what, at the very far end, and we'll come back a little bit later with another story about the far end of the Ile de la Cité. So here you see what he did with that. This is, again, one of many preparatory drawings and sketches and so forth, and collages, as he mentioned in that quote, that he created, which, and of course, some of these, before he sold them in order to raise funds, he, of course, had to use many of these drawings when he was making, he and Jeanne Claude were making their various applications to the powers that be in the city of Paris. So they had a very important function, not just an art function. And so here you see one of many drawings that he did, and then on this beautiful photograph on the right-hand side, evening in Paris, the lights, a little bit of light in the sky. And you can, the kind of fabric, I do not know exactly the type of fabric he used, but you will see from this and other photographs I'll show that it had a very interesting kind of sheen to it, that different kinds of light reflected off of it according to the time of day and the quality of the artificial lights. And so this was a wrapping that did not in any way impede traffic, either underneath on the water or across the bridge itself. Just think about it. I consider this such a beautiful work. So here you see the bridge itself. Here you see the bridge. Let's see, no, that's the other end. This is the Pont Neuf here. So it's at the very tip of one end of the Île de la Cité, island of the city, one of the oldest parts of the city of Paris. And although you can't make it out very well, this is the site for the cathedral, Notre Dame, just to give you an orientation. And then on the right side, another one of the many preparatory sketches that he made. And you can see that here he's using a color which is quite close to the natural color of the stone of that bridge. So he's really, in all of these drawings, of course, and in the finished work, he's really capitalizing on the extraordinarily powerful sculptural aspect of the Pont Neuf. Now you see what I mean, the whole different color here in this nighttime scene, and then the daytime scene is a very different way in which the light reflects off of the kind of fabric which they chose. And you can see that the traffic is going back and forth. And even the bateau mouche, maybe some of you have traveled in Paris and have taken one of these tour boats around in the Seine. There it is, plying its way underneath the bridge there. So here we have a comparison of the bridge itself here. Looks like a, yes, this would be a late afternoon kind of light with the kind of golden light of late afternoon, because this would be the west side of the bridge. And then one of the many preparatory drawings, which gives you a sense of the milieu, the skyline in the background. And I went back too far. And you can see here in the distance the Eiffel Tower and so forth. And this is probably the Invalides over here. That's where Napoleon is buried. Now I said earlier that I would take a little kind of sidebar to take you to the other end of the island. Remember that this is the Pont Neuf, where the bridge was covered. And at the very other end, behind the cathedral, at the very, very tippy end, is a very important monument. It doesn't have anything to do with Christo, but it's just something that I wanted to bring to your attention, because it is so unseen that people that are walking on the surface back here in the gardens and so forth aren't necessarily even aware of this. This is the Monument aux Déportés, which was installed in 1962. And it's an underground monument in this place here that I pointed out. And it's an acknowledgement of all the thousands and thousands of people who were deported during the Second World War. And most of them being Jews, but there, of course, were many other kinds of quote unquote undesirables that the Nazis scooped up, put on the trains, and deported to the east. And I find it very interesting that the French, when they were building this monument, did not actually mention the Jews in this, in the making of this monument. They made it a little bit more general. I think in a way you could argue that this is a touchy subject among some people. But in any case, it's a very moving, I visited there, and it's really a very moving monument, which puts me very much in mind of the later Vietnam Memorial, with the names and the inscriptions. And that's all there is. There's no other bodily remains or anything like that. I once talked to Maya Lin, the designer of the Vietnam Memorial, if she was familiar with this, and she said no, that she was not aware of it. So it's kind of an independent inspiration there. Okay, we're going to leave now Paris and talk about another topic. This is another Christo quote. All the energy of the project is revealed through the permitting process. And this is a very understated way of talking about this extraordinary kind of negotiation that had to go on sometimes for years to bring a project, especially the urban projects, to bring it to fruition. And this brings us to another kind of topic, another, shall we say, another perspective on Christo and Jeanne Claude's work. And to that, I want to explain what we mean by social sculpture. And so I put up here a nice little definition that I took straight out of Wikipedia. So social sculpture is a phrase used to describe an expanded concept of art that was invented by the artist and co-founder of the German Green Party, Joseph Beuys. Joseph Beuys, I think, died in the late 80s or so. He would certainly have been an artist that Christo, Jeanne Claude, and many other people in Paris would have been familiar with in the 1960s. In other words, he's an older generation of artists. And so what Beuys really created this term, social sculpture, to embody his understanding of art's potential to transform society. And not just through objects and pictures on the wall and so forth. As a work of art, a social sculpture includes human activity that strives to structure and shape society or the environment. The central idea of a social sculptor as an artist is an artist who creates structures in society using language, thoughts, actions, and objects. And I think in a way, that's a very accurate description of what Christo and Jeanne Claude were up to in most of their careers together. And I should add in here, this would be a good place to put in a little side comment. I actually met the both of them and interviewed them. This would have been in 1979. When I was on a sabbatical living in New York. And so we were seated at a round table in their Soho studio, home, etc. And so both of them were there. And I, at a certain point, I asked Jeanne Claude directly, you know, what her part was. I knew kind of what the answer was, but I wanted to kind of draw her out. And she demurred completely. She said, "Oh no, I'm just in the background," or words to that effect. It's very interesting. That was 79. It was only in the 1990s that they officially acknowledged their partnership, their total collaboration and partnership, and giving Jeanne Claude equal billing, so to speak. And from that time on, they always used the joint signature, Christo and Jeanne Claude, which had been true all along, but now it became much more official. So feminism works in slow ways sometimes, but it does work. And probably nothing could be more true to that idea of social sculpture which certainly Jean-Claude would have had a big hand in, than the project that involved the Reichstag in Berlin. Now imagine wrapping a whole building. There's a whole different set of factors involved in wrapping a building compared to wrapping a cliff or a bridge. And this is, you can see, a very large building. I'm showing you on the right a project which actually never came to fruition, but you see one of his many sketches for it. This is the old Whitney, not the new one, but the Whitney which is now called the Met Breuer, Breuer being the architect of this particular building in New York on Madison Avenue. And so here he's wrapping this up in a package, and not unlike the kinds of small packages he was doing back in the 1960s. But that's just to give you a sort of point of reference between wrapping this building here, much smaller, but was never completed, and this ginormous building, the Berlin Reichstag. And therein lies quite an interesting story. Here's the whole slide of that building. Now, of course, the Reichstag had a very important symbolic place in German history. I should start by saying that Germany only very recently, in the late 19th century, became a unified country. Through most of its history, it was a bunch of provinces which, more often than not, were arguing or warring with each other. And so it was a great achievement to become unified in the late 19th century. And so the Reichstag, which is the parliament building, was a very important symbol of that final unification of Germany, which, as we all know, didn't last very long. First of all, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, he created a fire in the Reichstag and totally closed down the functioning of the parliament and so forth. So end of that story, so to speak. And so it stood as kind of an idea of ruined democracy for a long time. And it was then, after the end of the Second World War, was on the Russian side of the east-west borderline. And so it was on the eastern side of what became the wall, the Berlin Wall, which of course stretched way beyond just Berlin. And so it was isolated from the West, and so it, in a way, became a symbol of the separation and the isolation of East and West. Well, imagine Christo taking on the wrapping of the Reichstag as a project. It was 24 years of negotiation before this finally happened. But in 1995, which was 6 years after the reunification, taking down of the wall and so forth, that pretty much had to happen. But still in all, imagine the chutzpah of Christo and Jeanne Claude of even thinking that they could negotiate the wrapping of the Reichstag while it was still under communist control. That did not fit their communist idea of an artwork. And so it becomes really, since it happened a full 6 years after the reunification of Germany, it became something of a symbol of the reunification and of a whole new chapter, a whole new era in German history. So I'm showing you a couple of the photos from a distance here. Here you see the Brandenburg Gate here, another very important part of the 19th century cluster of architecture here. And then this same sculpture you're seeing, just as a point of reference, looking beyond to this detail. Imagine, you've seen the scale of the building. Imagine the complicated aspect of creating the wrappings for all of this. But even more complicated, the negotiations from all different kinds. Everybody had to get a voice in yes or noing, yay or nay, on whether this was going to happen and how it was going to happen and when and all the rest. But I have to say, Jeanne-Claude and Christo really took the long view, 24 years of planning in order to bring this about. And as with the Pont Neuf, you can see that different lights, according whether it's time of day or whether it was lit up at night, brought out different colors and different aspects of the sculptural aspect of the building. So to me, the wrapped Reichstag is a wonderful example of a social sculpture because it took innumerable planning, and I have a picture here of them with some of the sketches and photographs in the background there. It's not, I'm sorry, the digital quality is not good, but this is a much better sort of view of the completed building on the right. And so as social sculpture, I think it's extraordinarily successful in the way that it had to bring all different kinds of groups of people in government and all different kinds of private groups together to bring this to fruition. So Christo again, the real is the real. The work is not a photograph, not a film or an image. It is the real thing. And I would add to that, I think for him, the real thing is this, this social aspect of not only the negotiations that go on in order to bring the work to fruition, but also the way in which once it's in place, the way that it changes people's perception towards each other and towards in this case, towards the Reichstag as a building with a very important history in German democracy. And I think the culminating aspect of Christo and Jeanne-Claude's work, especially in terms of the idea of social sculpture, is the work that they did in Central Park, New York, called The Gates. I'm thinking that there may be people that are listening to this talk that actually were able to visit that. It was up for about a month in February of 2005, but look at all the years that it took, almost as long as the Reichstag. Let's see, 79, 89, 99, and yeah, it took even longer to bring to fruition than the Reichstag. And of course, New York being as political as Germany is. I remember when I interviewed them in 1979, remember that I interviewed both of them in New York. They were already talking about the gates, and I'm thinking probably that was pretty close to the beginning of their planning for the gates. So I'm starting out here with some aerial views just to give you an overall sense of how it worked. Like the running fence in Sonoma and Marin counties, it's almost as long as that running fence, although it's not a one continuous running fence like it was in California, but rather many different pathways that were covered with these sort of orangey, saffron colored fabric, which you can see in the snow. It's a particularly nice picture, but then it was like New York is in February, kind of changing weather, and so the snow melted, and then you see just little bits of snow here. So it's kind of more, the gates are more hidden by the trees. Well, one of their first proposals to the city was back in 1983, and you can see here the city rejects Christo's plan for Central Park gates. And let's see, I think it wasn't Dinkins who was the mayor. His name will come to my mind. But in any case, it was turned down by a lot of different agencies in New York. And as Christo said, I'm in good health. Central Park isn't going away. I have a lot of patience and I'll be back. And sure enough, in February 2005, it was under the jurisdiction of Mayor Bloomberg that the gates came to realization. And you see him here with the Jeanne Claude and Christo. You see with Mayor Bloomberg, and then the two of them by themselves. And I was there. I have a hoodie to demonstrate that. And all the merchandise that was on sale at that time, they made a point of saying that all the profits from the merchandise went to the Central Park Conservancy. So they were always very attuned to the environmental aspects, even though the Sierra Club and a lot of other environmental groups were very often the first to kind of raise the hue and cry and say, no, 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 you'll destroy our landscape and so forth. But in fact, the environmental groups very often became the biggest enthusiastic sponsors. So why do I call this a culminating project of social sculpture? Well, since I was there, I can really kind of report from my own experience, because I was there for several days, and over that period of time, I walked the full length, one point or another, of Central Park, which I'd never done before, from all the way from 59th up to 100th, 90th Street. I think that's the top of the park. So it's a long, and of course it's 3 avenues wide. And it was a very interesting experience. New Yorkers really keep to themselves. They keep their eyes to the ground. They don't sort of acknowledge each other walking around. Everything changed with the gates. And you found perfect strangers from all different kinds of parts of the world, as well as all different parts of New York, stopping to talk to each other and sharing experiences of the gates. So this is social sculpture at its best. So there's a social sculpture where when you're looking at the way in which the negotiations that brought the project to fruition act on people to see different perspectives. But then there's also the social sculpture of the way that people interact because of this environment that is put before them. In this case, 23 miles of these gates. So here you see a few more pictures here in the wind blowing through. And as I remember, the bottom of these curtains were probably about 7 feet above the ground, so that very tall people could probably barely, touch them, but I couldn't, and you certainly didn't have to stoop to go underneath. And here's a wonderful view where you see not only the gates snaking their way through in one part of the park, but then the skating rink in another part, and you see all more gates going by there, snaking through all. And needless to say, all the roadways that normally go through Central Park were also closed off for that time, except a couple of the crosstown. That's really difficult to cut off crosstown traffic. So just before we get to that, I want to say goodbye to the gates, which I consider extraordinarily successful. And it brought such joy to people that participated in it. Even though it had a lot of critics, one of my very, very favorite critics I'm a big fan of his. Peter Schjeldahl, who has been the art critic for the New Yorker for years and years, and before that, critic for the Village Voice. And he kind of was very sniffy about the gates. But finally, when he visited, he sort of gave it sort of a begrudging, yes, this is a joyful occasion. But you could tell that he had a lot of reservations in his mind about, well, I don't know, how does this fit into my definitions of art? And that's where we come to the title that I gave this talk, the invention of a new art form, because really Christo and Jeanne Claude did go way beyond the framing of art such as it existed in the 20th century, and really exploded it out into the environment, including all different kinds of populations of people that would never see themselves inside of a museum, for example, or an art gallery. So I think that's all to the good. One of the last projects, not the last project, but one of the last projects that Christo and Jeanne Claude were working on was going to be a screen, like you see in this drawing here, that would hover over the Arkansas River, which actually is in Colorado. And so you see one of the drawings that he did, which suggests that it's kind of a semi-transparent and with the sky coming through, so it wouldn't completely darken the waters, and to suggest that he has some kind of a boat there skimming along the river. There's a lot of white water on the Arkansas River. However, this project never came to fruition. And here you see a little partial map of where it would have gone. The Arkansas River Project, Colorado, it was withdrawn by Christo 2017. Now, just say no to Christo. Now, this was often the reaction to so many of his projects. And as I mentioned before, some of the loudest detractors very often came around to be the biggest fans when they really dug in and saw what his intentions were and so forth. So posters like this was not why Christo withdrew his project in 2017. This river, this part of the river, lies on federal land. So when Trump was elected, Christo decided, since Trump really heads the federal government and therefore federal lands, he was not going to have anything to do with that. So he withdrew that project, even though he'd been working on it for years and had already invested millions of dollars, again, of his own money, into the project. So to the end, I would say he was a man of principle. And by now he's standing alone, because by 2017, Jeanne Claude died at the age of 74 in 2009. Well, as I mentioned, Christo died on May 31st of this year, 2020. And it seems like a very appropriate epitaph and farewell that his final project, which is still in the drawing stage, will actually come to completion. He or his team will be installing a wrapping on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. I mean, you can't get more central, besides perhaps the Cathedral of Notre Dame, than the Arc de Triomphe. And so there it is with the étoile. Many of you are familiar with that from having visited it. And with two drawings here suggesting what it would look like at one of the approaches, and then from a sky view on the right-hand side. Originally, it was going to be installed in October of 2020, but of course it has been rescheduled for 2021, and let us hope that we will be able to go forward with something like a normal life by that time. So I hope you have gotten a lot out of this art talk and learned a few things about contemporary art and about the work of Christo and Jeanne Claude and how they expanded the idea of what is art. That's it for now.